Next Chapter Podcasts.
The world is growing more complicated by the day, but too often, everyone seems to be operating on the same old assumptions about global affairs. But if you're not sure that world domination by the United States is the right path for America or the world, or if you've got questions about conventional geopolitical thinking, you should check out American Prestige, a foreign policy podcast from a different perspective. Every week on American Prestige, historian and former Bernie Sanders foreign policy advisor Daniel Bessner, that's me, and my co-host, the journalist Derek Davison, analyze U.S. foreign policy from a critical framework that sheds light on myriad topics related to international affairs. So, if you're curious to know what U.S. foreign policy would look like if the interests of all people in the world, and not only rich Americans, were taken into account, then check out American Prestige at AmericanPrestigePod.com. That's AmericanPrestigePod.com. And you could, of course, also find us on your favorite podcast app.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
People aren't moving to Charlotte to have their property taxes and taxes increase. Like, they're moving to Charlotte because it's cheaper than New York, it's cheaper than DC, it's cheaper than wherever. And so there's a limited political appetite to say, let's increase this investment in these resources for our schools.
The alignment is broken right now. K-12 is over here doing its thing. The community college over here doing its thing. Higher ed's over here doing its thing.
If you look at the payroll of the school, the teachers with seniority use the seniority to move to the suburban schools. And so the inner city schools are populated with those with less experience who get less pay.
Our average age is mid-30, and we have a whole segment of our community who went through K through 12 and had minimal civics and social studies instruction on how this government worked and are expected to navigate in this system and understand how the system works.
You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and don't nobody want to hear it, but it's like this, the South got something to say.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our New South, a podcast series presented by the Levine Museum of the New South in Charlotte, North Carolina, with the generous support from the Knight Foundation. My name is Kevin Blackistone, coming to you from College Park, Maryland, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Robert Green, a professor of history at Claflin University, and we truly thank you for tuning in today. Over the course of this series, we'll be discussing the concept of the New South and how it's evolved with academics, activists, and creatives. We'll investigate the South, asking questions of our expert guests in key areas like socioeconomic mobility, voting rights, and discriminatory practices that have shaped the South over the decades leading up to today's challenges.
We thank you for joining us on this journey and ask that you please tell your friends and family about us. Follow the show, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. Okay, let's get to today's episode of the show.
The South got something to say.
Today's episode of Our New South focuses on the challenges faced by Southern cities to provide fair and equal education in school districts that are becoming increasingly populated by students of color. We will discuss how the Brown versus Board of Education and the Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Supreme Court decisions forever changed American education, especially in the South. Before we get to our guests, I would like to ask Dr. Robert Green to provide us with a brief history lesson on education and the South.
The American South has shaped and has been shaped by debates about education in America. Long seen as the great equalizer and the way to get ahead in American life, Education continues to be both a place where many Southerners put their hopes and dreams for their children, and also a place rife with the divisions that define many of the nation's problems. From the beginning of the American South's history, education was thoroughly and comprehensively denied to enslaved Africans. Also, most white Southerners were denied a quality education in the 18th and 19th centuries. This would all change with Reconstruction, however. Pro-reform Republicans, many of whom were Black Americans, pushed for true public education across the South. For the first time, states such as South Carolina offered public education to everyone, regardless of race or class. In South Carolina, the flagship institution, the University of South Carolina, even briefly opened its doors to Black students, faculty, and staff. And from 1873 to 1877, the university proved that education did not have to go on the path of a Jim Crow system, as it unfortunately would in the next century. Throughout the South, new schools of higher education were also formed during the Reconstruction period, now known as historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs. These schools became the reservoir of hope for Black Americans only recently emerging from slavery. Schools such as Howard, Fisk, Claflin, Benedict, Tougaloo, Talladega, and so many others taught generations of Black Americans and prepared them to change the South for the better in the 20th century. In the K-12 educational system, a separate and never truly equal system of education would form across the South after the fall of Reconstruction. This would be codified by the Supreme Court's Plessy v. Ferguson decision in 1896, but nonetheless, Black Southerners would work hard to create a quality education for themselves, their children, and their children's children. Then came, after decades of hard work, the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954. Now, segregation was declared unconstitutional. But how would the South be pushed to change education? And what would a new, desegregated Southern education system look like? Many Southern cities and states would resist desegregation tooth and nail. It would not be until the early 1970s that the South would finally see real and lasting desegregation of its public school systems. A 1971 Supreme Court decision centered around Charlotte, the Swan v. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education decision, would thrust the Queen City to the forefront of educational reform in the country. Charlotte would become a model of properly done desegregation, utilizing busing in the process. However, a generation later would see the end of that busing model and a decline in Charlotte's public education system. The city's reputation as the city that made desegregation work would be disrupted by the 1999 federal court decision to lift the busing requirement set forth by Swan. In the generation since then, Charlotte's school system, like so many across the nation, has experienced resegregation.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Our first guest today is Decker Gongang, a strategic thinker and social impact consultant who currently serves as the managing director of the Saul Family Foundation in Seattle, Washington. Decker is a Charlotte native and grew up attending public schools there during a time when Charlotte was nationally recognized as the city that made desegregation work. Our New South welcomes Decker Gongang. Once again, thanks for doing this. I've read some interesting things about your rearing in North Carolina, but I would love for you to introduce yourself to our audience by telling them where you grew up, what you recall of that rearing, and when you maybe begin to think about where you grew up as being what we call the South?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much from the beginning. I mean, I think that in many ways, the South was like our first mascot, like our first team that we cheered for, in a sense. Like growing up, you knew the history and the legacy of not just slavery and but Jim Crow, but it's very much entwined in how you understand society is organized. Even as an elementary school student, like we understood civil rights because they taught it to us. Like I went to Irwin Avenue, and one of the first integrated schools in after Jim Crow in Charlotte. And so like these stories are part of like what you know of society. And so before I knew, I mean, we didn't have a sports team back then, but before I knew a sports team, I knew the South, you know?
That's interesting. And so you came up, you were steeped in the experiment of educational integration.
Oh yeah.
What was that like?
It's weird in hindsight, but it's one of those things where I wasn't present to it when I was a kid, but I also was present to the fact that this was all new. Like I was in open school and I understood integration, and I rode the bus 3 hours away from my neighborhood past lots of elementary schools to go to this school. And I knew that it was for a reason. And so I understood that there was a sacrifice, but I also didn't really know exactly what that was for. Like, it's not like today where you have these workforce development things and like you tell kids it's for jobs. And back then it was like an open school, and I was going to integrate the school because there was a higher purpose and that I would benefit from it in a different way. And my mom was taking this risk to say, hey, I think it's worth it. And my mother grew up in a very segregated in Jim Crow. And so for her, I think that she was also making that investment in what that future would be. And so I felt it. Like I felt that I was like, oh, there's a lot of white kids in my school. Like there's a lot more white kids in my school than in my neighborhood. And those things you recognize growing up, and you also recognize that it was for a reason. So yeah, I was cognizant of being kind of in this petri dish, but I hadn't yet understood why. And it's interesting. Every year of school, I believe that in many ways I started to understand more and more what it was. So like going from elementary school to middle school to high school, I started recognizing the differences that I saw outside of school in the social and economic stratification and what was different about in school. And so it almost like in many ways like changed me and made me understand it more and more as I went through the schooling.
That's interesting. Robert, you want to follow up on that?
Oh, definitely. Now, first off, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. And I think that what you've just talked about is incredibly important to Charlotte's history, because I think some of our listeners may know, many of them may not, but Charlotte was one of the leaders in desegregation of schooling in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so I want to follow up by asking you about the kind of quality of education you received in those schools. Because again, during the time period in which you're attending elementary, middle, and high school, people are saying Charlotte is doing desegregation the right way. They're providing a model for desegregation for the entire country. And talk a little bit more about that in terms of how you experienced it, and then looking back on it now, how you think about it, having some further reflection and distance from it in the decades since then.
Yeah, I mean, I think to be crass a little bit, I think the reasons why we said Charlotte was doing it the right way is because of who was doing it. It was the Charlotte elites sending their kids to the hood. Like it was the Charlotte elites from the banks, from I don't even know where they were, but basically the rich people in Charlotte from Myers Park, this very, very, very elite area, sending their kids to West Charlotte, to the West Side to go to school. And it worked. Like there wasn't fights. There wasn't all the different things that you would assume would happen, or people would assume would happen if you mixed everything together. Like there wasn't like this remembering the Titans type kind of tension. In many ways, what worked is because it was centered around education. Like we had amazing instructors. Like we had, I remember West Charlotte, the school we went to, had a number of like PhDs teaching in school and choosing to teach there instead of in colleges. And so I remember back to like all of my teachers in high school and middle school, many of them were doctor, like Dr. Bratton, Dr. Kaiser, like Dr. Butler, like there were all these names, and I was like, oh, they're like, I didn't think of it at the time, but I was like, that's weird to have these PhDs in school. And so one, I don't know if it was because of the fact that elite parents were sending their kids there. And so to answer the second part of your question, I think what worked is that everybody was making a sacrifice. And until I got older, I didn't realize that sacrifice was also kind of uneven. And so some of us were riding 4 hours on the bus. Like I remember I caught the bus at 5:45 in the morning in high school and got to school at 7:15. Like it was like I was up before my mom was, and she taught school. And so that was the sacrifice I was making. A lot of elite rich white people in Charlotte were making a sacrifice. You don't want to say similar, but they were sending their kids to the hood. Like imagine instead of going to the local private school, you tell your peers and friends at the bank or wherever you work, like I'm sending my kid to West Charlotte. And so you could see that there's these different investments that people were making. And then also I think what worked about West Charlotte was that I'm pretty sure, and I can remember it, those elite rich whites also invested their social capital. Like I just remember that we had volunteers at the school. Like we never had a shortage of people in the office helping out. Like all those things that usually are shortchanged at inner city schools, those kind of soft resources, not just money and paper and pencils, but who can answer the phones? Like who can manage a fundraiser? Who can work the booths at all the football games? Like I just remember being at West Charlotte, the West Side. Kevin, the equivalent is like when I lived in Columbia Heights in DC.
Okay.
And Howard. It felt very much like West Charlotte to me. Like imagine like going to a Howard game, a high school, let's say high school near Howard, and having a whole bunch of white parents working the concessions. And so like that was the fascinating thing for me in hindsight. It's like, wow, all these rich white folks drove to the hood on Friday nights to like work the stands and like be PTA parents. And so that worked.
You really kind of touched on that question in the sense of how, looking back in retrospect, what you think more about in terms of education in Charlotte. But I do have a very quick follow-up to that, which is, what do you think really pushed the white elites in Charlotte to make these kind of sacrifices to really buy into this system of desegregation of the public school system?
Aspiration. I mean, I think that if anything, the brand, I think, of Charlotte is an aspirational city. Like growing up, that was also the other kind of like theme that I felt. Like just the story of not just Bank of America and Hugh McCall, but of NASCAR, of wrestling. Like our first athletes were bankers and wrestlers and NASCAR drivers. Like in the city, like there was very much an aspirational, like we are going to make it. We're going to build this thing up. And so I very much think that it was a brand. Like I think if you were a place like Charlotte and you realize that we kind of believe in it, and if you have enough powerful people that believe in it, everybody else kind of gets behind them. And then they realize that, oh, this thing can work and it can be something that we can, like, that can advertise our city. And so we had a governor as well, Governor Hunt in my years, that also invested in it. Like North Carolina realized, like, if we created an education system, both higher education system, but in some of these select areas, these public high schools, it can kind of be a beacon that separates us from other areas. So when we're recruiting from other places like Atlanta, this could set us differently, set us apart.
You know, when we started talking about the idea for this podcast, and as I told you, I'm from D.C., and we started talking about this idea about the South, Charlotte was not a city that came to the front of my mind, right? When I think of South and Southern cities, I think of Atlanta first, of course. I think of Memphis, Nashville, Birmingham, maybe even for bad reasons, New Orleans, but I don't think of Charlotte. But you're telling me that Charlotte was really doing a lot of smart things that other cities may have taken a piece from for their soup to try and mimic, or not, I shouldn't say mimic, but try and get the product that Charlotte developed. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's fair. I mean, I think, and the reason for that, and I like the way you phrased it. In many ways, it's almost like where Charlotte was like a science project, and so we don't learn just by the successful science project. We learn by how this project may have failed. And I think with Charlotte, what was unique about Charlotte, which I think is unique from Atlanta, Nashville, etc., is you had a CEO of a headquarters of a global institution that was also the cultural leader of a city, like Hugh McCall. And so Hugh McCall, Harvey Gantt, Mel Watt, and kind of level 1B helped kind of craft what the community was. And then you also had the business leaders like the Johnny Hare, like the real estate developers as well, like all kind of like working together to figure out like, what are we going to do? And you didn't really have that level of control. I would argue you don't have that level of control in another major southern city. Like even in Atlanta, it's still diffuse. Like that power is still diffuse in Nashville the same way. Like you don't, and in Charlotte, because of the fact that Wachovia and Bank of America were growing so fast, and you had a governor that was in line from an educational and social policy standpoint with the big CEO that was in the area, it created this like influence campaign that you could do stuff. And so some of that stuff worked and some of it didn't. And so then you had all these other cities able to kind of learn from that.
Now, I think it's especially interesting that you note how different Charlotte is from other cities in the South, especially Atlanta. I'm coming at this from a different perspective because I'm currently living in Columbia, South Carolina, and often many folks here are looking to Charlotte as a potential model to say, well, that's a good idea. Why can't we do that, right? But you also mentioned how Charlotte has changed a lot, partly because of the fact that folks are kind of streaming in and out of the city. There isn't a chance for there to be atrophy in terms of ideas, but certainly things are not what they were when you were growing up there. Most notably in education. So we noted earlier how the city was a model for desegregation, but in the last few years, the last generation or so, there's been a lot of concern about where Charlotte's public education system is right now. For example, today, about 80% of Charlotte public school students are minorities. In terms of high school students, about 50% of them are proficient in reading and 26% are proficient in math. So in your estimation, what is it that really explains how Charlotte's public education system has changed, many would say for the worse, over the last generation or so?
So one, I would start at zooming out, like macro level. I think the purpose of education has changed. And I don't want to say like for the worse because I'm not an ed policy person, but the focus on workforce development and jobs like has created the role of schooling has become very transactional. And so with that, it's it feels like it's become a less I don't want to say less friendly educational environment, but it's just a different educational environment that I would say that we grew up in because it's the numbers as well, like the investment in education and the amount of resources coming from the state with legislatures decreasing investment in education and funding more vouchers. Like there's small things that are changing. The tenure of the workforce. Like my mom taught for 30 plus years in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. I would argue that the number of 20 plus year teachers has decreased with the decrease in proficiency. Like there's a lot of other variables that went into, I think, these school districts and school systems that created like opportunities created that proficiency. And then the last thing is like social stratification. Like I think that people are less well off. And when they're less well off in communities across the city, when the cost of living is higher and wages are still what they were 10 years ago, the money for after school camps and programs, access to the libraries that are increasingly inaccessible because I can't live near the library because that library is now in a gentrified neighborhood. It's like all these different things that I look back on my time as a student and realize like I had all these free resources that supplemented and complemented my education that kids don't have today, I think is where we should kind of like also focus, not to say that they are the sole reason, but I think when you look at places like Charlotte with such a massive shift in population, the city's resources and ability to provide the same level of social and educational services is not catching up because it's a negative. People aren't moving to Charlotte to have their property taxes and taxes increase. Like they're moving to Charlotte because it's cheaper than New York, it's cheaper than DC, it's cheaper than wherever. And so there's a limited political appetite to say, let's increase this investment in these resources for our schools.
I think that does it for me.
Oh, same here. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. This was great. Like reflection. I haven't had to talk about the South in a long time, and so this is really nice.
Our next guest is Arthur Griffin, who presently serves on the Board of County Commissioners in Mecklenburg County, representing 1.2 million residents living in Charlotte and the surrounding areas. Arthur is a Charlotte native and served for 17 years on the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education, 5 of those years as board chairman. Our New South welcomes County Commissioner Arthur Griffin. Arthur Griffin, I'm Kevin Blackistone. How you doing? Good to meet you.
I'm doing wonderful. Pleasure's on my side.
Great. And I hope it's a wonderful day in Charlotte like it is here in Washington, D.C. Beautiful day.
It is beautiful. The sun's shining. It's about 52 degrees. Wonderful.
Great.
We call this a Chamber of Commerce day here in the South.
I felt that coming.
We'll take a snapshot and send it to you. So come on down.
Well, as always, we like to start out by having our guests introduce themselves to our audience. And for you, I would like to know where you're from, where you're at, and what it is you do.
Well, I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, during a time when African Americans had to be birthed either at home or in an all-black hospital. So I was born here in Charlotte, North Carolina, in Good Samaritan Hospital back in 1948. So that just tells you how young I am today.
Outstanding.
I've had a phenomenal career, retired out of the United States Army as a lieutenant colonel. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I served my community in many different capacities. One as a school board member for 17 years. I chaired the school board for a little while. As you know, public service is not the best economic ladder to pay for college. So I had to leave that and go to New York and work with a private corporation called McGraw-Hill. Retired from that experience, back home in the Queen City, and sitting on my retirement couch when a good friend of mine asked me to get back into this political game. And a year ago, I got back in the political game and ran for at-large seat on the county commission representing the entire county. And fortunate or not, the citizens here in Mecklenburg County thought I might be a good person to support, and I won the election last year. So I'm now a county commissioner at large, representing 1.12 million residents of Mecklenburg County, married, grandkids, the whole 9 yards. So I'm living the life right now, Kevin, enjoying the world.
Well, congratulations. That does sound fantastic. You lived through the Swan decision on desegregation. How has that begun to transform that old South, and what do you see today?
I would tell you that the initial transition from the Swan desegregation case was filled with hope. There was a sense that equity, equality was on the rise, that the experiences that I had of having to, the teachers hunt and peck, trying to find resources to do experiments in physics and chemistry and biology, that those resources are now available. And so students were able to participate on a fairly even footing at the various desegregated high schools. So there was promise and hope, tremendous promise and hope in the late 60s and early 70s as school desegregation from the Swan case was being rolled out. And the Old South was beginning to embrace school desegregation and racial desegregation in the community, because we were able to kind of go to restaurants. You were able to go and participate in different public events. More and more municipal employees were getting hired in terms of local government. 1965, we had the first African American to make it of the city council, Fred Alexander, who also was a graduate of Second Ward High School. Okay, his name was Fred D. Alexander. And subsequently, you had Harvey Gantt coming in to Charlotte from Clemson, Charlotte, and he got on the city council. As you know, Harvey was our first African-American mayor. So things were starting to roll as a result of Swan. So the economy was booming as a finance center, with the second largest finance center outside of New York City. So that brought in a lot of in-migration. So a lot of people from around the world not just around the world, started moving into Charlotte. And as a result of that growth created a tension on sort of Happy Valley, Charlotte, where people were okay with going across town on a bus to go to this school versus that school. Well, the new people coming into Charlotte didn't see that as being an advantage or something that they would like to embrace. And the end of the 90s, 1997, a gentleman, a family sued the school system to basically stop busing. And this was a family from California that moved in, ironically, that thought that having lotteries where black kids and white kids would put their names in the lottery to go to the segregated school, thought that was against the Constitution. And so after several years of litigation, Charlotte started to dismantle all of those gains that were made from Swan. So you started to see a drifting back of segregated schools to a point today where when Swan started in 65, the first lawsuit, the second was in 69, it was 70-30. 30% African Americans, 70% white. And then subsequently where we are today, we have about the absolute reverse. We have about 75% black and brown kids and 25% white kids in the district. So that's where we are today. And I've said it so quickly as if it happened overnight, but it happened over years. That trajectory of moving away from something that was so good to something that is not as good today in terms of segregation and resegregation and desegregation.
Yeah. And so what do you do to solve that situation?
Well, I raise hell, number one, because I'm not a politician who wants to get elected again. People want to vote for me, that's fine. If they don't want to vote for me, that's fine too. But I raise hell trying to do something that we should have done a long time ago. Align all of these resources. Align pre-K to public schools. Align public schools to your workforce through your community college system and your university system. The alignment is broken right now. K-12 is over here doing its thing. The community college over here doing its thing. Higher ed's over here doing its thing. And so there is no visible pathway with respect to moving from pre-K to computer scientist or finance major or advanced manufacturing. 45% of the workers in Mecklenburg County, Kevin, 45% are low-wage jobs.
So at the beginning of our interview, you said that Charlotte was the ultimate New South city between D.C. and Atlanta. But it sounds like from what we've talked about this afternoon, you have some very mixed feelings about what the New South is. So could you give us what your definition of the New South is?
My definition of the New South is that here is a community that now has both a social and an economic opportunity to lift all of its people. The Old South had a social opportunity, but not an economic opportunity in terms of there were businesses and stuff, but we were locked in to our little neighborhood. Okay. The New South certainly gives us an opportunity that we didn't have.
Appreciate it.
Keep doing good stuff, guys. I hope that helps.
Our final guest on this episode of Our New South is Congressman Bobby Scott, an American lawyer and politician who has served as the U.S. Representative for Virginia's 3rd Congressional District since 1993. Congressman Scott is a nearly lifelong resident of Virginia and served as chair of the U.S. House Education and Labor Committee from 2019 to 2023. Our New South welcomes Congressman Bobby Scott. Congressman Scott, thank you very much for joining us. And I'll just introduce myself again. I'm Kevin Blackistone. I'm a journalist up here in Washington, D.C. at the Washington Post, do some stuff on ESPN, NPR. I also teach here at the University of Maryland in the Journalism College. And this is my colleague on this podcast, Robert Green, coming to you live from maybe Orangeburg, South Carolina today?
Well, today, actually Columbia, South Carolina.
Columbia. All right. Not in your office. So this podcast that is an extension of the Levine Museum of the New South is really exploring the idea of this latest iteration of what is the New South. And before we get started, we always like to have our guests introduce themselves, where they're originally from, where they are now, and what it is they do.
I grew up in Newport News, Virginia. Went to a boarding school in Massachusetts for high school, Harvard College, Boston College Law School, and then returned home to Newport News to practice law. I got elected to the State House about 4 years later, in 1977, State Senate in 82, and U.S. Congress in 92. And I've served in the United States Congress from 92. It's now 2024.
And what brought you back to the South after all the time that you spent way up north?
You know, it just seemed so natural. My father was a physician in Newport News. He had a well-established practice. My mother was a school teacher, and I just assumed everybody went back home after they went to college, and so there wasn't much question. After I finished law school, I came back to join a 3-member law firm, and when I got elected to the House of Delegates, that put a real strain on things. So it's very difficult to practice law and serve in the General Assembly. So law practice struggled for that period of time. It was a good practice until I got elected.
Congressman Scott, again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. This is Robert Green II coming to you from Columbia, South Carolina. And I am particularly intrigued about your work on education in Congress. That's perhaps what you're best known for. As a son of the South, could you tell us a bit about, number one, why education is so important to you? And number two, how you've seen education in the South change during your lifetime, going from Jim Crow segregation to post-Brown v. Board to where we are right now?
Obviously, back then in the 50s, the tail end of Jim Crow moving into the civil rights era, you recognize that number one strategy for change has to be voting. But after you vote, you don't have anything unless you have also education. You can have the opportunity for jobs, but unless you have people with the proper credentials, they can't take advantage of those jobs. Can't participate in economic activities. So education is really the great equalizer, and something I'm sure your parents have heard it. Education is something, quote, they can't take away from you. Once you've achieved your education, it's something you've got, and it just enables you to participate in civic activities. If you have a good education, you don't have to discuss your qualifications. Your education qualifies you for whatever your educational achievement qualifies you for, and that's the end of that discussion. Then you can go on to what you want to work on. But unless you have a well-educated community, you're always be at a disadvantage. You're not going to be able to participate economically. You're not going to be able to participate civically or politically unless you have a well-educated community. And so focusing on education has been a priority. And if you can get that straight, I mean, a lot of other problems are solved with a good education. You talk about criminal justice. Well, if people are well educated, they're not getting in trouble. Healthcare, better educated people have longer life expectancies. I mean, it's just really the key to upward mobility.
And as a quick follow-up, because I think you've laid out quite well why education is so important, especially to Southerners. Could you talk a bit about what are some of the issues with education you're seeing in Virginia and across the South in 2023-24? What is it that you see as some unique challenges in terms of getting a quality education today?
Well, regrettably, they're not a lot different from what they were in the 1950s and 60s. We have found that segregated schools produce segregated and disparate opportunities. And you want to know what the problems are today? The schools are as segregated today as they were in the late 1960s. We made a lot of progress from the 50s, the 60s, and 70s, and we've been regressing ever since. And with that segregation goes the limited opportunities, funding disparities, over discipline, and so solving the segregation problem is still a challenge. And with that challenge goes funding. Because if you don't have, if you have the segregated schools, the political reality is they're going to get the schools the minority students attend will get the short end of the stick when it comes to resources. If you will notice, the schools populated by African American students that school gets less money. And if you just think about it, if you look at the payroll of the school, the teachers with seniority use the seniority to move to the suburban schools. And so the inner city schools are populated with those with less experience who get less pay. We want to make sure that the resources are fair, and you can't do that when you have segregated housing patterns and segregated schools.
And so what is the impact of all of that you see on the growth and the opportunity towards upward mobility for people of lesser means, for people of color in the state of Virginia, given that this has been going on for so long?
Well, it's not just state of Virginia. These are national problems. I know in California, half the black students a couple of years ago, I don't know if they fixed it or not, but a couple of years ago, they calculated that half the black students could not qualify for the University of California at Berkeley because a 4.0 grade point average just wasn't competitive. You needed AP courses to get you above 4.0, 4.2, 4.3, so that you would have a competitive application. If you don't have AP courses offered at your school, you can't get them. You get straight A's and can't get above 4.0. And that was half the black students couldn't even qualify. So I think those resources make a difference in your opportunities.
And what kind of opportunity do you see for those kids in the state of Virginia now? And I say that also as the son of a mother who grew up in Halls Hill, Virginia, which is now Arlington, which is a segregated community in which she had to walk past the white high school in order to get to the segregated high school, which Virginia would not let her attend because they said it was filled to the gills. So she borrowed an address from friends in Georgetown, because at that time Georgetown was predominantly black, and wound up going to Cardozo in Washington, D.C., which is where she made her career in the government.
You might not be able to blame that on Arlington County, because Arlington County was one of the jurisdictions that closed the schools under massive resistance. The Brown v. Board of Education language, the operative language was that it is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if denied the opportunity of an education. Such an opportunity, where the state elects to provide it, is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. All Virginia saw in that powerful statement was where the state provides it. So they said, oh, whoa, if we don't provide it, we don't have to integrate the schools. We don't have to do anything on equal terms. So, every time the court ordered the schools to be integrated, they would close the schools. There are several jurisdictions, Arlington, Norfolk, Prince Edward County was part of the Brown v. Board of Education case, Davis versus School Board of Prince Edward County, Virginia. Those schools were closed for 4 years, but Arlington was one that closed.
Now, Congressman Scott, you mentioned a moment ago that you were interested in not just talking about problems, but the solutions to some of the issues that we're talking about this afternoon. Could you talk a bit about the work you've been doing with President Biden, in particular, on education in recent years? Of course, there has been massive federal investment in public education under the Biden administration. So could you talk a bit about where that funding's going? And more importantly, what are some achievements you've seen with that funding so far?
Well, I think the best thing we did in recent history was the American Rescue Plan Act. A lot of people are talking about the PPP loans and other things. Child tax credit. There's a lot of stuff in there, but one of the best things from my perspective was the funding for education. The biggest one-time investment in K through 12 education in the history of the United States by far. And it was distributed according to the Title I formula. So all this disparity that's been going on, the Supreme Court, I think, would not have looked favorably on funding based on race. But Title I allows you to base funding on poverty, which in America correlates with race, so that the schools primarily attended by African Americans under a poverty-based formula will do well. There was a study done just before the pandemic that showed that 40% of the school districts in the country needed to repair or replace the heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems in over half their schools. Well, you can't reopen in the middle of an airborne pandemic if you got an HVAC problem. And so a lot of the money went to fixing that, which should have been fixed a long time ago. Keep them open safely. How are you going to open in a pandemic without a school nurse? Most of these schools didn't have nurses. Counselors, you got people are coming back with all kinds of mental health issues. You need counselors. So to open safely, stay open safely, and make up for lost learning. People were looking at this test scores towards the end of the pandemic and said, oh man, look at these bad scores. I hope they're bad, because if they were good, that means the schools hadn't been doing anything. These people hadn't been at school for a year and a half, 2 years. What were they no school that you expect them to do as well? Of course they're going to do poorly. Question is, now that you have quantified it, what are you going to do about it? And you've identified those who may have been able to do well over Zoom and those that weren't able to do as well under Zoom, and be able to target your resources.
Now, as someone who's a college professor, I want to take this conversation to the realm of college life. Of course, a lot of your work has been with K-12, school districts and the like, but you've also done a lot of work in terms of helping out college students, especially those who are financially disadvantaged. So could you talk a bit about some of the challenges you're facing there, especially because debates about student loan relief and student loan debt have become quite prominent in recent years?
Well, I think if you're going to talk about the student loan problem, I think it's helpful to say a word about how we got here.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in college, the first part of the Pell Grant program, Pell Grant covered 80% of the cost of going to a state college, tuition, room, and board. Now it covers about 30%. With the 80%, you could get a summer job and work part-time during the school year and graduate no debt. Now you can work 40 hours a week and not come out and can't afford to go to college without taking on significant debt. And so there's nothing wrong with this generation other than the fact that we're not putting up the kind of money that we used to put up. States used to put up a significantly higher portion, pay a significantly higher portion of the cost of going to a state college than they do now. And so the students are having to take on crushing debt.
Well, thank you so much. This is fascinating. I'm glad we got somebody from the 757 in here to talk about it, the greatest athletic area code in America, as I always point out. In our closing reflections of today's podcast, we have a quote from Derek Johnson, the current president and CEO of the NAACP, as he speaks about how the educational systems in the South have historically impacted African Americans. Derek Johnson is featured on the Our New South podcast episode about voting rights. So how important is this whole educational system right now in the South, particularly as it impacts Black folks?
So if you narrow cast it to the South, Southern states, as a result of Brown versus Board of Education, which would be a decision from 70 years ago, they participated in what was called mass resistance. They did all they could to prevent full integration of public education. Much of that we overcame. But what Southern state legislative bodies started doing, they started withdrawing financial support to school districts. And in this country, unfortunately, we have a model of funding schools based on property value. And so if you have enclave of high wealth communities who work hard to keep Black people out, those schools are funded much stronger than low property value communities. And so now we are finding ourselves in the midst of another tipping point around delivery of education. Teachers are not paid their value, and we are ushering in AI technology, machine learning to train kids because of teacher shortage. So you have a system that was designed over 100 years ago to meet the needs of the prevailing industry of any particular community, only to train people to be laborers, not critical thinkers, that was vastly underfunded, with new technology being brought in and whole communities left behind. I am afraid what that's going to look like 20 years from now. That I just mentioned earlier that our average age is mid-30, and we have a whole segment of our community who went through K through 12 and had minimal civics and social studies instruction on how this government worked, and are expected to navigate in this system and understand how the system works.
You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear it, but it's like this the South got something to say.
Our New South is brought to you by the Levine Museum of the New South in Charlotte, North Carolina, thanks to the generous support of the Knight Foundation. Our New South is produced by Next Chapter Podcast. It's written and produced by Byron Hunter. The editor and sound designer is Kyle Murdock. Executive producers are Jeremiah Tittle and Franky Abbott. Our technical producer is Brian Douglas.
With special thanks to Levine team members Alexander Piñeres, Karen Sutton, and Cliff Whitfield.
Please follow the show, subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast. Learn more at ncpodcast.com/Our New South and museumoftheNewSouth.org.
The South got something to say.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Next Chapter Podcasts.